Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and did you see that? It's like a little intro that I made. Thank goodness for templates, huh? I'm probably gonna say that's a work in progress, but I think almost everything in this channel is a work in progress, much like the decks we work on. Ooh, seamless transition into Firkraag, Cunning Instigator. This is a Goad deck that comes to us from Pajur, who says they would like me to lower a bit of the mana curve to smooth out the deck, and their only deck building restrictions are not to lean into Dragon Tribal just for convenience. The goal is to force people to damage enemies. We can definitely do that. I am, always happy to go beyond Tribal or Kindred decks, so very happy to see that we're not going all in on dragons here. But as always, if you'd like to look at the deck in question, or if you would just like to add your deck to my list of decks to work on, you can find it all in the video description below. Probably I'll make this part something that I can edit and put it in because, I have to say it like 20 times and I'm never good at it. But let's get into it. So who is Firkraag Cunning Instigator, and why are they our Dragon Goad commander? Well, they're a 5 mana 3/3, sorry, I wish they were a 5/5, Flying Haste Legendary Dragon. They say whenever one or more dragons you control attacks an opponent, goad target creature that player controls. And whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, if that creature had to attack, you get to grow Firkraag with a +1/+1 counter and draw a card. So, the really important thing about Firkraag is it's one of those one or more dragons attack opponent kind of text lines. What that means is the maximum number of triggers we can get is for each opponent per combat. So in a regular kind of combat setting, we're maxing out at 3. Now, that's not too bad. A 5 mana hasty commander that, threatens to grow and can set up a draw 3 each turn, I do particularly like that. If you remember recently, we were looking at Missy and I was talking about, the limits or the powers of having a commander that is, let's say, able to draw 3. And I believe Missy, I'm going to look up in the side, I believe Missy was 6 mana. Yeah, so at 5 mana, I like it a lot better. I like Firkraag has evasion, and I like that it's not just drawing us cards, it is setting up some particularly powerful kind of turns. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the deck itself. And I do think the deck is in a pretty good position. There's a lot of cards that I like, and there's a lot of directions that I like. But the one thing, as one may see right down here, is that our curve kind of goes for a while. If we look at the curve down at the bottom, we can see it even further as it kind of bunches up in the middle and goes down further all the way to 8, as 9 is Blasphemous Act. Now, I don't mind the bunching up. I think the extra cards at 5 and 4 are kind of the ones that are tough, even at 6 to an extent. But specifically, we're going to have to look at the cards at 5 because those are the cards that coincide with our commander's cost. And as I always say, you don't want your commander to be competing with these other cards, or I guess I should say, you don't want these other cards to compete with your commander. Now, sometimes that's not as important, especially at higher mana costs. Once things go to 5 and 6, sometimes we don't worry about that as much. But Firkraag is like one of our main, strategies to win the game. So it is important to check out what will, let's say, what goes against him, what competes with him within the deck. So, looking through here, I think there's a lot of choices I really like. I namely like there's quite a few low mana dragons. I'm going to add at least 1 or 2 more, but I think that's something that's really important for Firkraag to work. With Firkraag, we want to get in those 3 triggers as soon as possible. And now we can do that by setting up that curve of a 2 mana, 3 mana, 4 mana dragon and then Firkraag. I wouldn't mind it to be even lower to the ground, like 2 2 manas and 1 3 mana, and with some ramp, get Firkraag out early, or something along those lines. I don't know to what degree. Something that's really, really important to note is that Firkraag does not require those creatures to hit, only to attack. Now, there is a bit of a downside, and I'm going to try to work on that in some additions, but one of the downsides is that opponents without creatures are basically immune to Firkraag. Not only do you not get to grow him, you also, or them, I'm not quite sure, but you also can't draw cards. There's nothing to goad, so there's nothing to grow, and there's nothing to draw cards from. And that can be kind of tricky. If you have one opponent that's completely just not involved in combat, well, you're in this situation where, you know, you might as well have only 2 opponents for your commander's abilities. So we'll come back to that because I'll have some suggestions. But until then, let's take a look at the higher parts of our curve. Now, one of the things I do note is there's quite a bit of activated abilities throughout all of our creatures, especially some really good ones like Maeve, who allows us to goad creatures and draw cards off of them, right? And the thing is, we need quite a bit of mana, and we don't really have the means to easily create them outside of green. So instead of just saying we're just going to put some more mana rocks and move on, I think something we should just be aware of is how many of these kind of abilities that we want to get off there are, and what can we do with them. So starting nice and easy, we've got Solem Simulacrum. This is a card and I feel like a lot of people, but I particularly have kind of fallen out of love with. It's just a little too much mana for either ability. There's a lot of like utility in a card that does 2 things really well. And if you look at this card as a 4 mana, or like if you split it into 2 and say 2 mana to draw a card, 2 mana to get a land tapped, it's not so bad. But even then, that isn't really good enough. We can do a lot better these days with the power creep. So outside of decks that aim to blink this card, aim to reanimate it a lot, aim to cheat it out into play or reduce its mana cost, I don't find it really good. As a fair, like 4 mana card, I don't particularly like it, and I would generally cut it from lists. Looking a bit further, we have quite a bit of dragons that aren't as synergetic to our goals. Something like Veric BladeWi. Veric BladeWi is a 4/4 flyer, and then if kicked, you get another 4/4 flyer. So that's not ideal, right? That's 7 mana for 2 4/4s. I do appreciate the fact that it comes with an extra body so you can trigger our commander a lot easier, but even then, that's not a lot of damage, that's not a lot of board presence, and it's a lot of mana. I think a lot of times you're just going to be casting Verics for their cost and just have a 4/4 flyer. So with that in mind, I think this is an easy cut. This doesn't further our game plan, it's just a dragon. And even as just a dragon, we can do a little better. But we can see even like right after Ganax, I like a lot more, because Ganax or any dragon enters the battlefield, you get a treasure token, is really, really nice. I think this is one of those things that's like, our deck builder was talking about how they didn't want to make the deck like based off of dragons, and dragons like this are really good for that, because we're really just playing Ganax for, you know, that ETB and the ETB on all of our other dragons, kind of reducing the cost of our spells while being a dragon that can attack. So this is like a perfect example of a dragon for the deck. Glorybringer is nice because it is removal. Imrith is a bit weird. Imrith is a card I keep seeing around in these decks. And like, I get it because there's not a lot of really good blue dragons to choose from, but even then, I'm just generally unimpressed by it. A 5/5 trample, a 5/5 flyer that has ward 4 until it attacks. Not only is this kind of a problem because at a certain point, when you have enough dragons, you're not worried about single target removal anymore. You're worried about board clears. And Blasphemous Act or Toxic Deluge or Wrath of God or anything like that, Farewell even, will just ignore that ward 4. So that ability becomes a little weaker. And then Imrith's main ability of dealing combat damage to a player and then drawing a card, and if you have 3 or less, you draw up to 3. Like, that's not gonna happen in this deck, right? Like, the first thing is you have to draw the card, and then if you have less than 3, you draw the difference. What does that mean again? That means at 1 card, basically if you have no cards, you'll draw 3 cards total. If you have 1 card, you'll draw 2, and you have 2 cards, you'll just draw as usual. And when you start mathing all of this out, counting our commander and their own draw triggers, you might as well ignore the second half of the text, because it's very, very likely that your hand is going to be at least past 3 most of the game. And with that in mind, a 5/5, as long as it's untapped Ward 4 flying creature that draws you a card on hit, I'm really, really unimpressed with it. I don't think it's particularly good. I think you can do better. I think things like another copy of Abidant of Thassa, like reconnaissance style effect, will just be better because you will draw more often and it's less vulnerable to removal. So with that in mind, I think Imrith can be easily taken out. Scaran Hellkite also feels just a little bit like a vanilla dragon, right? I do appreciate that it is a hasty 5 mana 4/4, but it has both another mana sink that doesn't work with our whole theme, and is otherwise kind of an unimpressive dragon. And once again, at 5 mana, that's fighting our commander, who is the best 5-drop dragon, or should be, in our deck, and therefore I think we can get rid of the Hellkite easily. The Wrathful Red Dragon, I do like this here. I think with Blasphemous Act, this is a very, very strong combo. I think there's other ways that we could make it even stronger, but just as that baseline, I think it's really, really good. I mentioned before that one of the threats when you have enough dragons is to be board wiped out of the game, and Wrathful Red Dragon says no to like one of the most common board wipes of Blasphemous Act. There's another one I tend to see in red, which is each creature takes damage equal to the number of creatures on the battlefield board clear, and this is equally strong against that. So both of these board clears become basically void with a card like this, so I really, really do like the Wrathful Red Dragon. Easy, easy keep. Death's Kiss, on the other hand, in theory, I like this card. This is one of those cards that I wish was split into 2 cards. So the first half that says whenever an opponent's creature an opponent controls attacks one of your opponents, double its power until end of the turn. I like that. That's the part I like. I really don't like the monstrosity cost and even the fact that it goes. This is another massive mana sink. Consider that in order to go 2 creatures, you need 5 mana, which would make this an 11 mana like sink that you've poured into this creature. And even then, like, what, you're gonna go 2 creatures? Like, I just don't think that's good enough, right? If we just had access to the first half that says whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks one of your opponents, double its power, I would be more than down to play this card. But at 6 mana with this monstrosity card cost, I think it's really easy to cut it out right away. Moving on, Lath's Dragon Queen. I do like this. I think this is a nice finisher for the deck, so I'm not gonna say anything. It is in the end just a big dragon, and she is very, very strong and will produce a lot of dragons, but at the same time, that's all she'll do. So depending on how deep you go into dragons or how much we cut out of dragons, this creature's abilities will kind of vary back and forth based on it. So right now, I think it's fine, but if we cut too many dragons, I think we will lose that ability. As we play lower mana dragons, which I will suggest a few, like these get better because Sprite Dragon becomes, you know, Sprite Dragon itself, and then you get a 5/5 is really good rate, like how much mana you've spent in to get Lathis. Whereas instead, if you're like, you play Lathis and then you play like the Wrathful Red Dragon and you get like another 5/5 for 5 mana, like it doesn't seem as good as a deal. So generally Lathis I like a lot more with a lot like smaller dragons, and we're gonna try to go for that and see how that goes. Steel Hellkite is another card, much like Solem Simulacrum, that I feel like I've lost a lot of interest in over the years. I'm thinking that maybe like if your meta has a artifact player, an artifact, I guess it's not even non-land it says in each non-land permanent. Even then though, this is for engine decks, right? This is really good against any deck that's been setting up an engine and is trying to get it off the ground. So saga decks, food decks, clue decks, any form of artifact, like any setup deck where they have a lot of cards that tend to be, you know, low mana or consistently around the same mana, usually between 1 and 3. Something else that's really, really good is that you just attack and hit them and you press X for 0 or 0 for X, and then all of a sudden all of their food tokens, all of their like tokens, their creature tokens, all of those evaporate. And in that way, I think Steel Hellkite is really, really good. However, if we are using this incredibly fairly, so you're sitting across the table from me and you see, I don't know, Mazarek on my side, a 5-mana insect legendary creature, and you're like, I'm gonna hit Cursed with the Steel Hellkite and then destroy his Mazarek for 5 mana, I don't think that's a good idea. I think that's a lot of work for probably just destroying one creature. So Steel Hellkite, outside of taking out engine decks, token decks, some kind of kindred or otherwise deck, I don't know. I don't see it. So if those decks are around in your meta, absolutely play the Hellkite. If you're just playing the Hellkite fairly to see what you can destroy, do not play this card. It is way too much mana and continues the idea of a mana sink that we need to dump mana in. If X is 0, it's not a mana sink, and I don't mind that. All right, Warmonger Hellkite, another dragon with a activated mana ability, or activated ability. There is a big trend here, but Warmonger Hellkite is really, really good in this kind of deck. It is straight up just, hey, I am the finisher of this deck. As soon as all of a sudden this is out, all attacks are going off. Now, the thing is, it doesn't goad them, which is a little tricky, but the idea is that you have a giant 5/5 dragon to block most attacks, so they're probably not going to attack into you, but they could spitefully. So that is something to be aware of. You might have to play a little more political for this card that already usually does the politics for you. You know, if you have enough open mana to say, hey, attack my other opponent, and I'll pump your creatures and they'll get in. So all that to, I do really like the card, but it is a tricky card to play. Then we've got our last few. And these last two I have a bit of a harder time with. Skyline despot, I think it's a despot, is an interesting card, and I don't like it. I really don't like it. It is a lot, it's 7 mana for the Monarch is too much. And then the ability to have to go through an entire turn cycle to get a 5/5, and you have to make sure you don't get hit once. That doesn't seem worth it. Like, it is really hard to do these things. Like, if we compare this card to something like Luminarch, the Luminarch Ascension, where you have to basically go through like 4 times, or actually technically 2 because it's each opponent. So you have to do like 2 cycles of not getting hit by opponents. And in exchange for that, you get to basically summon tons and tons of angels. Here you have to go through the trouble of not getting attacked for an entire turn cycle to get 1 5/5. And I just don't think it's worth it. If we want the Monarch, I'm sure there's another dragon. I could be wrong, but there has to be that. Okay, that's the only one. But what about initiative? All right, so we have one option if we would like to get initiative at 4 mana as opposed to 7 mana for Monarch. Now, they're not the same thing, but initiative is really, really good. Except for this creature is pretty awful. They have defenders, so it doesn't work with our whole idea. But for what it's worth, it gives menace and haste, so it's not terrible. If the monarchy is the reason you're playing this card, play Stirring Bard instead. If you're playing it to create tokens and, you know, smash face and like use it as the card is intended, I would probably look somewhere else. This is a lot of mana for something that will only somewhat work and is liable to help your opponents in certain situations by giving them access to the monarchy. So I really don't like this card, so I would cut it for sure. Astral Dragon, on the other hand, is a fantastic creature, really, really strong. I really like it. Doesn't even have to be your permanent that you're going to be making copies of, but I think we have enough stuff that is somewhat worth making a copy of. The bar is low, right? literally almost anything, any of our artifacts. I guess that's it. It's our artifacts. A lot of our enchantments are auras, so they won't work. But if, you know, if we get Kindred Discovery or something, you know, that'll be really, really strong. So the ceiling is high on this card, but maybe we'd have to adjust some of the cards. I think it's often going to be like a mana rock you're going to turn into 2/3/3s, and that's fine. I don't see that being a problem. I think this is a really, really strong card, and if you can get a good card off your opponents, you'll be very happy. All right, skipping through for a few others. Mana Geyser. Mana Geyser seems particularly strange here, though I really like this card. This card works really, really well in decks that want to win in a single turn or get an unbelievable advantage in a single turn. And this deck is incapable of doing that. At most, what it can do is flip the script of the game by throwing down Warmonger Hellkite style effects, and all of a sudden, we're in combat zone. But you don't need that much mana to cast Warmonger Hellkite. Like, Mana Geyser is like, go from 5 to 15 kind of mana ramp. It is not, you know, go from 5 to 6. You can do a lot better in those kind of ways. So that in mind, this just kind of stands out as not a card you particularly want to play. And so for me, it's a very, very easy cut at 5 mana. Looking down a bit further, Draconic Lore feels like we could do better. This is instant speed, 4 mana, draw 3, only if you have a dragon. That feels close, eh? Like, that feels like I would want this to be stronger. And like, it's not, but I don't hate it. Like, as long as you have a dragon out, which is pretty universal, this will be a 4 mana draw card. However, if you are behind or the board's been wiped, this is too much mana, right? 6 mana to draw 3 is way, way too much. So I don't love it. I think we could do better, but at the same time, if you've got it and you like the card, I'm not going to fight you too much on it. Hit these, everything else is good. Everything here is fine. I like these 5 mana spells because they're basically game ending, and I think we're otherwise good. All right, so I've got some suggestions here, generally. I've got a lot of different suggestions, so this might not be in any particular order, so we'll bear with me a little bit. We'll talk about each one that comes out. So the easiest one to add is just Lightning Bolt. I think there is very, very rare situations that I do not like having Lightning Bolt in my red decks. It is an immensely strong card in every format it's legal in, and this is a format it's legal in. People really underestimate the power of you being able to take out their commanders for 1 red, so make sure you have it. Something else that's worth noting, Bothersome Quasit is a very, very powerful card, and having an extra few instant spells can really improve how strong of a card it is. So I don't know if I'm adding many after this next one as well, but it is something to consider. And this next one, which is the other instant card I want to give, is less so like this card, but more of something to kind of think about. So here's the idea here. I would like you to play a little more Countermagic. Why am I saying this? Well, okay, here's the idea, right? So Goad decks have existed forever, and they exist in so many different color combinations, but they're generally like base red, and then you add the other colors for other bonuses. Now, obviously, you might be like, I am adding blue for a bonus. I'm playing it so I can play Firkraag, right? Yes, I understand that, but how else are we using blue? And something that blue adds that other colors can't add to Goad decks is Countermagic. So how do I put this? So Goad decks are kind of like, they're combo decks that kind of lean on their pieces really hard. By that I mean, like, we have a lot of different Goad abilities, from Goblin Diplomats to like literal Goad with Bothersome Quasit to like Disrupt Decorum. We've got these. These are great. But in order to take advantage of these Goads, we need cards like Firkraag, we need cards like Maiev. Actually, Maiev does her whole thing by herself. But specifically, let's say Firkraag for sure. Firkraag is like one of the strongest cards in our deck because it turns all of those Goads into draw cards. I think I said earlier in the video that Firkraag draws you 3 cards. That was incorrect. Firkraag, with its own ability, can draw a maximum of 3 cards, but with all of your other Goad effects, you can draw way, 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 way more. So, sorry it took me this long to correct myself, but that is something to consider. So Firkraag is like the core of our deck. And what blue allows us to do is protect those core cards, because otherwise we're just kind of in trouble. When Firkraag is off the battlefield, yes, we're creating a lot of chaos and our opponents are like whittling each other's creatures and life totals down, but we're not getting as much of an advantage as we could. So counter spell cards, protection spell cards in blue, dispel, a lot of these kind of, there's like, is it turn aside? There's a bunch of like different counter magic that can protect your commander. And I think you can definitely play as like a few of them, like 3 to 4 of them without anyone batting an eye, because I think your deck will just really benefit from having those like available to you. That's not even including the ability of just counterspell, not just protecting your commander, but changing giant plays, stopping board wipes, stopping, you know, giant spells that they themselves will change the rules of the game, and you being available to kind of say, no, I don't want that. I also will say this combos really, really well with a lot of something I've been pointing out a lot, is that a lot of your cards have mana sinks associated with them, which allows you to hold up mana. Like Maev's out, you get to hold up mana, which is that counter magic. And what happens is at the end, you know, what happens at the end when you run out of, like, when you haven't counterspelled anything, is you can just use, now Maev's not a good example because you want them to attack that turn, you goad them. Let's see if we can find something else. Well, let's say it's something here. Like this, like let's just say Sly Instigator. Something that we can, at the end, if we haven't used as a, like, we haven't used our mana for our counter magic, we get to just dump all of our mana into cards like this that allow us to just put a few more extra goads all over the place, untap, and we still have our counter spell. That's something that's really important. Otherwise, you end up holding counter magic forever and not doing anything. So having counter magic with mana sinks is really, really good. So that's my like kind of sell on counter magic for a deck like this. Counter magic is not something I usually suggest because outside of high level commander, counter magic is always at a deficit because you're going 1 for 1. But it's like removal, like you are getting rid of the potential gains an opponent has, so you can usually get ahead with that, but it's still tricky. But in a deck like this with such card advantage and such important pieces to protect, counter magic is really, really good. Let's find another non-creature spell that I think is really interesting, and that's Invasion of Tarir. As we know, this is a dragon-themed card, but, you know, at worst, I think you can just play this as a 2-mana bolt. I don't particularly mind it. It does have quite a bit of health, but it is easy to whittle down with your flying creatures. And once you do, the Defiant Thundermaw is a pretty good addition to your deck. A 4 for flying trample, that's fine. But the idea is that whenever a dragon you control attacks is almost the same kind of text as your commander, and therefore you are getting extra triggers out of something you already want to be doing, which is something I always like. And the fact that it's just removal early game is really, really good. Do not be surprised how far you can do to make 2 damage go early game. This can easily take out a Mana Dork to a Dark Confidant to, you know, an early piece like one of those blue engineers that reduce, I think it's Chief Engineer, I could be wrong, that reduces the cost of artifacts. These are always good targets. You know, Lotus Cobra, just hit it with the lightning, and then later you're going to get a really good dragon out of it. Speaking of dragons, here's 2 dragons that I find to be a little interesting. Patron of the Arts comes in and dies, whenever it comes in or dies, it will create a treasure token, which is really nice. Likewise, Swashbuckler Extraordinaire, what a name, ETBs and creates a treasure, and then when you attack, you can sacrifice a treasure, and when you do, up to that many, 1 or more treasures will give that many double strike around. So something is interesting is that the double strike doesn't work as well, like because a lot of your triggers are when dragons attack, but double strike on a dragon is never a bad thing. But mainly, once again, I do like that these are 2 early dragons that immediately create a treasure token. As I've mentioned before, one of the things is we want Firkraag to be able to trigger like with those 3 attacks as soon as possible, and having these 2 lower mana dragons makes it a lot easier for you to do so, especially since they generate a treasure so that you can go from 3 to 5 when you play a land the next turn. This is something I really like. Then we're gonna go to, actually let's put this one here first. Sarkhan Soul of Flame is someone I noticed is missing in this deck and I think should definitely go in here. Not only does this just generally work well with dragons, but something I really do like is that he turns into basically a copy of a dragon whenever a dragon comes into play, just for end of turn. But this is really, really good with your commander, because when you attack with Sarkhan as Firkraag and Firkraag, because Firkraag has haste, you basically get to double. You just need 1 more attacker and you will goad 2. So how does it work? Yeah, you're going to go 2 creatures per player, right? And then on your opponent's turn, as those creatures attack each other, Firkraag is just going to pull in quite a few different +1/+1 counters and draw cards, and allow you to draw cards, sorry. And I think that's really, really good. And plus, that's not even just saying the ability to attack with haste with a creature like that. And then later game, when you go into your really, really big dragons, you're going to get even more value of like Lath and other big dragons that allow you just to deal more and more damage. I think this is just a really, really good card and should be probably near the top of your list of additions to this deck, but I'll leave that for you to finally decide. Let's look at another Goader, though it's not necessarily a Goader. I know this is in your side. A card worth considering is Curse of the Nightly Hunt. I'm not too excited by this card, but it is really good for what it does. If you throw this on like a red-black player, it's really hard for them to get rid of it, and it's going to bother them the rest of the game. And I do like that. But it is kind of a boring card, and I think it is just an inclusion if you want to get that ability. Like, if you really need this, this will do it, but it is a bit boring. Something that does something a little more interesting is Goblin Spymaster. And this is something that's going to go into the next card I'm going to show as well, is what's important about goading creatures is you need creatures to goad. So Goblin Spymaster is really, really nice. And because first you got a 2/1, and then at each opponent's end step, they get one of the Goblin creature tokens that is forcing the rest of their creatures to attack. Now, it's a little tricky because in theory, your opponents can attack each other with those goblins to kind of like try to set up situations where they can block and lose that goblin every turn. But this creates quite a bit of goblins. Like, remember, this is one of those cards that triggers 3 times a turn cycle, so I really like that. But these goblins are going to be kind of annoying to deal with, and it benefits your opponents to kind of leave them around. So with that in mind, I think this card does very, very well. It gives you creatures to goad, and then regardless if the goblin is goaded or not, the rest, like everything attacks, right? So it's as if it's pseudo-goaded, which will trigger your commander, and you'll be very, very happy with. But another card that I think is even better, and I know at 5 mana we didn't want to put in cards, but this is a card I always like putting into these kind of goad decks, and that is Rite of the Raging Storm. So, Rite of the Raging Storm is an interesting creature. It's an interesting enchantment. So what it does is that it creates a 5/1 every single turn. And then that 5/1 can't attack you, but it gives everyone else the incentive to be attacking each other with that 5/1. You get 1/2, which is great. So in a turn cycle, this creates 20 power, basically, on the battlefield. So here's the one thing. I thought it was goaded. I'm reading the card now, it's not goaded. So it won't trigger your commander unless maybe you use Bothersome Quasit, but I don't think that's a good use of that card. So it is going to not work with your commander. But in almost all situations, your opponents are very much so incentivized to attack with it. Something like Warmonger Hellkite or Goblin Diplomats can kind of make this better, but especially the Hellkite, because then they force to attack and all of a sudden, you know, you're drawing the cards off of it. But a 5/1 with Trample Haste is really, really good. And your opponents, they have to all be working against you in order to not attack each other. It's just free damage. And once again, every one of your turns, you get to do another, you get to attack for free anyone, right, with this? I really like this. I think this is very, very strong. This is like one of those cards, I think of like Black's Painful Quandary. This is like, to me, the red version of this, where you're throwing around maybe 15, 20 damage a turn cycle if your opponents aren't prepared to deal with it. And I think this card can potentially be even stronger because you can set up that 20 damage per turn, because that's how much power you're putting on the battlefield. Now, there are some nombos, so your opponents can benefit from getting this 5/1 or use it for other things, but I think generally you're pretty happy with a card like this, especially with the fact that with everything being goaded, there's just really low chances that your opponents are going to be able to block or deal with this card. So this is easy. Another kind of goading creature that I like here is Agitator Ant. If you've ever used the white version of this card, I believe it's like Orzhov, I want to say Evocist, but I could be wrong. But it's basically the same thing where everyone will, at the beginning of your end step or one point during the turn cycle, everyone picks a creature and grows it, and that creature can't attack you. But Agitator Ant goes further and goads that creature, which I really like. Now, at the end of the day, it is your opponent's choice whether they goad the creature or not, which is kind of a downside. But there's a bit of a trick here, right? And this trick works both for you and against you. But here's the thing. Let's say I attacked you with Firkraag, right? Or you attacked me with Firkraag and you goaded one of my creatures, and then you play on the second main Agitator Ant. Well, I'm going to pick the goaded creature, right? Because the creature is goaded anyways, might as well make it a bit stronger. Now, this might feel a little bad for you because I've gotten away with, like, I've gotten the bonus without goading an extra creature, and therefore it's like I got 2+1/+1 counters for free. But here's the thing, you kind of want them to do this, because as they grow their creatures, that extra damage goes to each of your opponents instead of going at you, or it just increases the damage being done. So even though they might feel clever doing this, you, in the end of at the end of the game, are benefiting from this. In addition, the easy goad on your side is Firkraag because of the fact that they have evasion. But even then, you can just choose not to goad if you feel like it's going to put you in a bad situation. All right, I have last two cards. These will be quick. I was thinking of finishers for the deck. There's that other dragon that I always forget what it's called, that, you know, every time you ETB a creature, it'll deal damage. That's a very expensive card, so I thought the cheaper alternative of Scourge of Valcas is really good, which is whenever a dragon enters the battlefield or this creature enters, a target takes damage for the number of dragons you control. And I think this is fine. This is a card I think that reasonably can do 5 or 6 damage on ETB, and then ideally do around that amount every other dragon you play. More with certain things like Lath or other combinations. So that's pretty good, but I will, or like with the 3-mana Sarkhan here, that is a really good combination because they will siege. Is it cast or enter the battlefield? Maybe I'm wrong about this. It is enter the battlefield. So that won't work, but if you can make copies of your dragons or clone your dragons, which you can in blue, or with the next card I'll show, this can get out of control really fast, and you can solidify your lead or take out a player really easily. Speaking of cloning your dragons, Helm of the Host, and this will be the last card I suggest. Helm of the Host is really interesting here because it's already generally a good card, albeit like really expensive to equip. But something I really like about it is that you have so many really good targets. From the really easy one is just your commander. When this is on your commander, you're just in a really good position to be creating more copies and getting even more benefit every time a goaded creature attacks an opponent. But Just other things like ETBs, such as the Scourge that I just showed, or the Astral Dragon, are really, really easy to trigger with Helm of the Host. And I don't think... Okay, so the legendary, picking legendary things is a little tricky, so you don't want to make 3 copies of Helm of the Hosts. But otherwise, getting just extra copies of your creatures, getting extra copies of like key cards like Bothersome Quasit is really, really good. And almost all of your cards just kind of increase in value the more copies there are. There's a few that's not like that. Warmonger Hellkite notably does not get better with more copies, but almost everything else does. So Helm of the Host feels really, really strong in a deck like this. And you don't get to often have that because, like, I know Helm of the Host is a really strong card, but there's a lot of decks where it's just 30% of the deck it won't do anything with. You can only like work with the really, really like the combo pieces. But in this deck, I feel like it hits quite a bit of the cards, and I think that's really, really good. And with that in mind, I think that's going to be the end of my additions. I think this deck is a lot of fun. Firkraag kind of strikes me as one of my favorite Goad commanders just by, you know, looking at this deck. I don't usually love Goad, and I think Firkraag hits Goad in a way that I think is really good, because otherwise it's difficult to make Goad work. So I do like this deck, and I'm interested to see how it kind of develops, because our deck builder didn't want us to go too much into dragons, but you could, right? There's a lot of different methods you could build this deck and like get that slider moving back and forth of how much you want to go into Kindred, or how much you want to go into Goad, or how much you want to get into combo, or other like middle stuff that you can do, how much mana production you want, how many counter spells. There's just a lot of versions of this deck, and I think it's a really interesting card and a deck to be building. So all that said, I'm really excited to see another draft of this deck, and it's time. This is another thing that I think I should have once my video editing skills gets to and the templates fall into place. If you'd like to send me another version of this deck or any deck, you can find a link in the video description down below. And down there, there's also a link that if you wanted to bring your deck to the front of the queue, make it one of the 2 decks I work on when I release videos, you can do that as well. And finally, if you want to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. The channel is growing, and I'm so grateful for the response I've been seeing from you guys. Thank you so much for the deck, and good luck making it even stronger.